Hi everyone, this is Veronica Johnson and welcome back to my studio. Today in the Dear Jane quilt, we are going to be looking at block K-1, which is also called Crooked Creek. This block looks a little confusing with the way Brenda has done her lines as opposed to how Jane has created this quilt block. There are a couple of things I wanted to point out before we really dive into making this block. One of the things is that on this quilt block, there is no border. You could see just a little bit along the edge here, but this is actually the sashing of that particular block. It's not the border. The line drawing that Brenda did, she added a border around this block. She probably did that because these squares are at a very odd size, and so she's reduced the squares to an easier size to cut. So these squares, when I measure, are 3/4 of an inch, but we need to go a little bit larger overall if we're going to make it a little bit more like Jane's block. And when I enlarged it, in order to get the overall size, I needed basically 15/16 of an inch square, which is a really awkward size. And most of our rulers do not even go to that size. So what I'm actually going to do is create these squares to be basically 7/8 of an inch. Plus a little bit. So it'll be a little bit of fudging, but we'll be able to make it just fine. Now, another thing I've noticed on the line drawing is just a couple of things. One is that right here in the block, this is actually a separate square, and Brenda just did one long strip. So I will actually be making a line here, and so that I have just all these individual squares. And the only two pieces that I will keep long are going to be this one here and then this one here shortened. So these will be the same length. And that's how Jane has it in her block. If you're able to look closely, this piece here is one solid rectangle, the same with this. The rest of the block is just these little squares. And then we've got our half square triangles right here. For this block, I've chosen as my main foundation fabric this really cute pink fabric with the little kittens all over it. And then my background is, of course, my muslin fabric. I have my fabrics chosen and I know kind of what I'm going to be doing. So let's break down exactly what's going to be happening here. It might be easier if you're able to mark either in your book or make a copy and mark on a separate piece of paper what you're doing. So when we take a look at Jane's block here, we're looking at first the colored squares. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're going to need 8 squares. Since I want them to finish just a little bit larger than 7/8 of an inch, I'm actually going to cut these squares 1.5 inches. So that will give me, it'll just be easier to cut. If you want to make it a little closer, you can cut them at 1 3/8 of an inch, but I'm just going to do 1.5 inches. It'll make it easier all around. So I need 8 squares of the foundation fabric cut, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the muslin fabric cut, also in 1.5 inch squares. To make these little half square triangles, I'm actually going to do 4 at a time. So let me show you the sizes that I've cut and explain how I'm going to do this. I have 8 squares of my pink fabric, or my main focus fabric, cut at 1.5 inches. I have 7 squares of my muslin or background fabric cut also at 1.5 inches. And I also have two squares, one of my pink and one of my muslin, cut at 2.5 inches. These two squares I'm going to create the 4 half square triangles. With this method, I'm going to be creating 4 half square triangles at the same time. I have both of my squares cut at 2.5 inches, and I'm going to be sewing them right sides together. On the back of my muslin, I've already drawn my line of 1/4 of an inch all the way around the outside. This is going to be my stitching line. I'm going to stitch both sides together, the right sides together. I'm going to stitch that 1/4 of an inch all the way around. You can see I've already stitched all the way around my fabric. And once you stitch across it, then cut a diagonal both ways. And once you cut on the diagonal, you will then have 4 of your half square triangles. Press them toward your darker fabric, and then you can trim these to size. For each of the half square triangles, I've trimmed off the little dog ears, and then I drew my 1/4 of an inch stitching line all the way around. When I drew that seam allowance, this square measures just between the 7/8 of an inch and 1 inch. So that ends up being about 15/16 of an inch. But that's the size that I needed to get this square. With these other squares, I also drew my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on 2 sides, and then I measured, and I will show you with my ruler. I had these 2 lines drawn, and then with my ruler, this shows this is my 7/8 of an inch. I went right in between that line, so I can barely see it right between. It's halfway through, and then drew my seam allowance, and I did that on both sides. So these squares are all going to be just over 7/8 of an inch. Now I want to lay out my block. Once I get all of the seam allowances drawn, I'm going to lay out the pieces of my block according to the way that they should be in Jane's block that she made. So we are still missing the 2 rectangle parts, but laying these out will let me see what I have and making sure that all the pieces are there. So this is the first row. Okay, this is the basic layout for this block. And I'm going to cut these rectangles once I get these 3 rows, these sections of 3 sewn together, because then that will let me know how long the rectangle actually will be. Since I'm working in 1/16 of an inch effectively, the math is a little too confusing, so it's just easier to measure once I get it sewn together. So let's start off by sewing these 3 units together. I have each of these 3 section units done, and they measure to be 3.5 inches long. So I am cutting 2 strips out of the pink foundation fabric to be 3.5 by 1.5. So they will go right here in between each of these units that we just sewed. Now for each strip, I'm going to lay out the ending squares that go to each line. So now we see that the block is completely laid out. So for each row, I'm going to sew the two end squares onto each of those, and then I can sew all of the rows together. So let's first start with sewing these end blocks onto each one. All of my rows are now sewn and they are in order. So now I'm ready to sew these rows all together. All the rows are now sewn together and the block has been pressed. Now I'm going to trim this up. And now here is our block all complete. I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of working on block K-1 from the Dear Jane quilt. This one is also called Crooked Creek. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. You can also subscribe and click that notification bell, and you'll be notified each time I upload a video, which is every Monday. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below, or you can send me an email at sewitseamscreations@outlook.com. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seams, and I'll see you next time.